It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course that means some extremely smart talk radio is in your future, and this segment, an interesting one indeed. We're going to be taking you back to Vietnam, a subject that we have not actually talked much about on the many years this program has been in existence, but we're going to do it today and kind of micro in and talk about the first family there, in particular the First Lady. We'll get into that a little bit later, but our guest this segment is Monique Demery, and she is the author of Finding the Dragon Lady. She is a freelance writer by trade, but she has many other accolades to her credit. She's appeared on The Daily Show, as well as numerous other television shows, also been published in the Chicago Trib, the Daily Beast, and Publishers Weekly. And anyway, should be an interesting conversation indeed. Monique, how are you, my friend?
Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here. Let's start here. We'll just take for granted that freelance writing is something you enjoy doing. You like doing research. You like doing. How did you choose the subject matter for Finding the Dragon Lady? Of all things you could write about, tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, I'm from Chicago, and I was born a year after the end of the Vietnam War, but my mom is French and my dad's American, so I always had this curiosity about Vietnam, and it was hard for them to answer questions about it. You know, they had friends that died in that war, they had friends that protested that war, and it's really just a confusing thing to explain to a curious kid. So I would look through picture books as a kid, and there were sort of the images of Vietnam that we all know, right? The napalming and the thatched huts and all that. But what really stuck out to me was this glamorous sort of woman wearing silk and long fingernails, and I got fascinated with this. With the subtitle was the Dragon Lady. So that must have stuck with me because all these years later, I was in the library and I was kind of digging around, and I thought, gosh, I'd sure love to read something about this woman that they called the Dragon Lady, and someone called her a sex vixen. I mean, I thought surely someone has written a great book about this. But the only thing I could find that was recent was an obituary, and it was for her parents. Her brother, in 1986, murdered their parents. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm hooked.
Wow. That is, so her brother murdered the parents.
Her brother murdered their parents in, 1986, which, again, to me just seemed like the Vietnam War seems like it was ages ago, and then 1986 in Georgetown seemed not that far away from kind of daily life. And I wondered about this woman that had always been painted as Dragon Lady, and what in the world is a sex dictatress? I needed to know more. And it turned out that she was still alive when I started. I found this obituary for her parents, but there was no obituary for her, which to me was a clue that she was still alive. So I kind of became obsessed with, it was sort of a hobby for a while. I wanted to track her down and see if she was still alive.
Well,
and sure enough.
Well, for those that do not know all of this history, and we won't go too deep into some of the history, but the first president of South Vietnam was Diem, and he selected her as, he appointed her apparently as First Lady in 1955, even though they were not married. It was her brother-in-law, correct? He was her brother-in-law.
Correct, yes. So Diem was the president, but he was a bachelor, and bachelor makes him sound like he was living the life. But he was sort of monkish. He would sleep on a hard wooden cot, and he was married to his country. That was kind of his image, and he was very Catholic, very austere. But his brother was the one who was in charge of the secret police. He was the one in charge of raising funds for their political party. His brother was the politician who got stuff done, and he was the one who was married to Madame New, this beautiful, young, very social, and had all the sort of diplomatic graces of a hostess. So she would greet the foreign visitors, she would go visit the orphanages, but she also was kind of an innate politician in that she realized the men were totally ignoring 50% of the population. she was like, hey, the women of South Vietnam have never had the right to own property or open a bank account. I mean, let's give them some agency. And so she really deserves a lot of credit, I think, for recognizing the power of women in South Vietnam in 1955.
Well, so Monique, let me ask you this: she's appointed the first lady, so she's not married to President Diem. She's married to somebody else, although they are related by blood, or she's a brother-in-law. What were her official duties? Were they figurehead, or what? Tell us about that.
Well, she was a bit of a figurehead, but then she got herself elected to the Senate. So she basically ran unopposed, because who would run against the president's sister-in-law, and got 99.9% of the vote, and got herself a seat on the National Assembly so that she could pass laws. And one of the first laws that she passed were to protect women and the family, and she outlawed polygamy. But then she kind of got, drunk on her own power and was like, great, while I'm at it, I'm going to outlaw gambling, push-up bras, prostitution, and what really ticked off the Americans was dancing. So there was a ban on dancing. So all the advisors that were stationed over there with Vietnamese girlfriends could suddenly not hold hands in public or go to the movies and kiss. I mean, people were being arrested by these sort of moral police officers.
And this was again a resentment of all things Western.
Well, not so much. She actually had a good point. She just didn't make it very well. Her point was that the communists have done a great job of recruiting people to this national cause and saying, we're at war, everybody's got to sacrifice. And in South Vietnam, we don't want to look like we're having a party. We don't want to act glib about this. We need everybody's got to be all in. And she really felt concerned that with all the American money and all the American advisors coming in, that South Vietnam was starting to look like a puppet of the United States. And they had just, come out from under the French, and they felt very strongly that they needed to keep integrity against the communists. So she makes a point, right, that it didn't want to look like we were having this party, this American-funded party, but she kind of went overboard.
Well, if you just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis, again from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio. We're in the midst of some smart talk radio, indeed, with Monique Brinson Demery. She is a freelance author, educated a variety of places, including Hobart and William Smith colleges, as well as graduate studies at Harvard University. And she's written a brand new work called Finding the Dragon Lady, The Mystery of Vietnam's Madame Nhu. And Madame Nhu, again, the appointed First Lady by President Diem of South Vietnam. What about, as you look through this work and you learn more about this interesting woman, interesting that she did work hard to put a ban on what many people would consider were sort of innocent, or at least things very Western in terms of glamour. There's a photograph, for example, in this work of her showing Lady Bird Johnson at the time her collection of tiger skins. And this woman was well-dressed, undoubtedly, like other women over there, had lots of pairs of shoes and was well taken care of. It's an interesting dichotomy, her desire to live a highly glamorous life and yet really not really wanting that for others.
You make a great point. Absolutely. She prized her crystal chandeliers and her silks and her perfumes. She really took pride in how she looked. But she also thought that there was a time and a place for glamour. And that picture of Lady Bird Johnson that you're referring to, so the Lyndon Johnson was vice president at the time, and President Kennedy had sent him to South Vietnam to take a look and see where all the American money was going. And Madame Nhu, she flirted with Johnson, and she sort of thought he flirted back, and she prided herself on that her whole life for having charmed him. And President Kennedy's sister went along on the trip too. This is his youngest sister, and they went up to Madame Nhu's bedroom, and she said, I never showed my bedroom to anyone, but I really wanted to shock these women. And so on the floor are these tiger skins, so many of them that, the jaws are overlapping each other, and they're laid out on her bedroom floor. And she said, my husband shot these for me, and every time he killed a beast, he would bring it home to me. It was sort of her pride. And an interesting thing about that is in the West we call Madame Nu the Dragon Lady,
right.
Meaning sort of like, be careful, she's dangerous. But in Vietnam, the dragon is a very powerful figure, and it's a compliment to be a dragon. So the Vietnamese that wanted to talk badly about her never called her the Dragon Lady because that would sort of confer too much power to her. So they called her the Tiger Lady. So it was quite fitting that she had all these tiger skins on the floor.
Well, Monique, that's kind of what my next area I wanted to explore was share with our Lewis at Large listeners, if you would, her level of acceptance and popularity amongst the Vietnamese people themselves.
Well, that was a bit hard to measure because by all the polls, it was 100% approval rating. But people were really coerced into voting for her and supporting her. And in fact, when the regime was overthrown, so there was a lot of resentment. They were in power for 9 years. And what eventually proved to be their undoing was the family was Catholic, and many of the people in the government that wanted to be promoted were converted to Catholicism, and their whole political philosophy was based on a Catholic philosophy. So the majority of the country being Buddhists were sort of like not feeling like they got their voice heard. And the thing that was finally their undoing was there was a Buddhist protest, an uprising of religion, saying that there was religious repression, and so at the end of the regime, Madame Nu's husband is killed, her brother-in-law is killed, and she's abroad at the time. She's in the United States. But this big statue of her that was on the waterfront was taken down with ropes, kind of like we saw in Iraq with Saddam's statue, and her head was chopped off and rolled through the streets of Saigon. So people were sort of celebrating that she was gone. And people went through the palace and took everything they could, from, negligees to ashtrays. The place was pretty looted. So she was not as well loved as she thought she was.
What kind of upbringing did she have? Give us a little bit about her background that might give us some insight as to why she was the way she was.
Sure. This was, for me, a driving question of the book. Where did she come from? Because she was not born into a Catholic family. She was born into a Buddhist family and a very well-to-do one. Her mom was a cousin of the emperor, so she was, in fact, royal blood. And her father was a lawyer. He had trained in France and in Algeria and had come back to Vietnam. He was one of the first Vietnamese lawyers to practice law. And so the family came from this fancy upbringing, but, her mom was 14 when she had her, so very young, and really resented that Madame Nu was not a boy, because if she had been a boy, she could have been done having kids, and she could have moved on to being to getting her life back. So instead, when Madame Nu was born a girl, Madame Nu really felt her whole life like her mom resented her. And I think part of what kind of drove her and what made her so ambitious was that she felt like she had something to prove, a reason to show why she was around. And so she got into a very public fight with her parents when she was First Lady, and the uprising with the Buddhists happened, and her mother sided with the Buddhists and said, someone should run Madame Nu over with a car and throw tomatoes at her and all, things that a mother should not really say.
What about, do you think, what did world leaders think of her? Did they view her kind of privately as a clown that they just sort of humored along the way, or tell us about that?
Well, President Kennedy, I don't think I can say on the radio what he said about her, but Jackie Kennedy said, that her ambition made her so ugly, and she called her a lesbian. She was like, she wants power and fame, and so that makes her sort of unattractive and a lesbian, obviously. Right. And Kennedy really resented the fact that it looked like Madame Nu. He said that the men trailed behind her apron strings. So I think that's really evocative, that she could say things and it looked like the men were following her, and to President Kennedy that was so emasculating. But in fact, in person, she was very charming and could, talk. There's an anecdote about her, and this is the height of the Cold War, and she's on the South Vietnamese, the side of the free world, and she's charming the Russian ambassador to the Inter-Parliamentary Union, and, this stout Soviet woman and Madame Nu are just chatting it up. And so I think she really could, if you got face-to-face with her, she could charm anyone.
What about, okay, so take us through, she's appointed in 55, and take us through her reign. How long was she the First Lady, and when that period stopped, then what happened to her?
Sure. Well, so the family was in power for 9 years, and Madame New had 4 children. So especially at the beginning of her tenure as First Lady, she was very focused on her own sort of internal family. But when she realized that the men were sort of ignoring the women, she really found her voice and made her point and appointed herself kind of the savior of the regime. There had been a couple attempted coups. People were starting to get sick of the power of the family in power, and she kind of told the men to muscle up. She was like, put it down, don't give in at all. So she kind of thought of herself as the savior of the regime. And when the final coup happened on November 1st, 1963, the one thing Madame New really regretted was that she wasn't there to stop it. She felt like if she hadn't been traveling in the United States, she could have somehow thwarted the coup. So she was in the U.S. when her husband and brother-in-law were murdered and the palace was looted, and her children were still stuck in Vietnam. She had one daughter with her, but her 3 other children, a 15-year-old, a 12-year-old, and a 4-year-old, were in Vietnam, and it wasn't clear that they were going to be able to get out alive. So she had to really call on the mercy of the regime that had launched the coup and the Americans to get her kids to meet her in Europe. And Madame New flew out, and she left her unpaid bills at the Beverly Wilshire, and she flew to Rome and was reunited with her children and spent the rest of her life in Europe. In the 60s, she tried to get a visa to come back to the United States, but that was denied, and then she never made it back to Vietnam, although the regimes kept trying to extradite her, kept trying to get her to come back to South Vietnam to face trial for crimes against her country, like being corrupt and putting people in jail and those important types of things.
Did she ever, prior to her passing away, ever return to Vietnam after things had settled down?
No, she did not. And she always thought of the communists as sort of a temporary thing. Like, I think she really thought that someone would rise up and overthrow them. And the name in French for communists, it sounds sort of cute, les coucous. So she would always say les coucous, like it almost sort of trivialized them. And I think she was just that she would never go back as long as they were in power. But I don't think she thought it was a permanent thing.
How will, in your opinion, when we look back on Vietnam, there were so many issues that began and ultimately were resolved there. Several were not, this maybe being one of them. How will history, in your opinion, look back on her and this whole era?
Oh, well, I think she's been portrayed kind of as the face of Vietnam, a symbol of everything that was wrong with the American involvement in Vietnam. Because we didn't understand her, we didn't really understand the country, and so we were giving her money to do whatever she was going to do with it. So, and I think that I hope that that the book explains that yes, she said some outrageous things and she went over the top, but she was also a complicated woman, and her intentions were actually quite spot on. She said a couple things that people at the time thought were totally out of line, out of bounds. She said, the press has been, she loved the word intoxicated. The press has been intoxicated by the communists. Well, what she meant was sort of poisoned by the communists. And in fact, she was right. There were several of their Vietnamese sources that were communists, and they were planted there by the North Vietnamese to help them tell their side of the story and get information. And there's a very famous one, Sam Swan An, who died not too long ago, but he was, anyways, Madame New sort of sounded the alarm about that, and everyone was like, no, that's impossible. And she said that the Buddhists were also intoxicated by the communists. And sure enough, by 1968, the Americans realized that, the Buddhist, the loose religious affiliation was actually a cover for some communist forces. So kind of sounded the alarm too early and maybe acted the wrong way, but she made some good points, and one of the most important of them was, that this was Vietnam's war to fight, and they were happy to take American money and American advisors, but that America shouldn't send troops over. And after 1963, when the family was deposed, and they were dictators, I'm not saying that they were saints by any means, but when they were deposed, then, the war did spiral out of control with American money and troops and young men losing their lives.
Well, it is a fascinating story about a fascinating era and a fascinating person indeed. The work is called Finding the Dragon Lady, The Mystery of Vietnam's Madame Nhu. Again, First Lady of South Vietnam from 55 to about 63, 64. The work has been written and authored beautifully by Monique Brinson Demery, and she is a freelance writer but has many, many projects to her credit. Hey, Monique, how can people find out more about not only the work that you do, but also, of course, getting a hold of a copy of the book, which, by the way, is published by Public Affairs Press?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. It just came out in paperback, so it should be available on all the websites, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and hopefully your local campus bookstore will carry it. That'd be great. And you can find me on Twitter or Facebook. And I'd love to interact with readers. So shoot me any questions. I'd love to hear from you.
What about what's next for you?
I've just co-written a book with a man named John Reardon, who has written a story about the fall of Saigon. So this is sort of the first days in Vietnam, and now we've just finished the story about the last days in Vietnam. And he worked for Citibank and saved 105 of his South Vietnamese employees and their families by adopting them as his children. So it's a great story and sort of a telling story about how the end of the war was a mess and how this one person could kind of go against our government and do the right thing by saving all these people and getting them out of South Vietnam.
Well, again, hey, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today, and also, of course, sharing this story, which is one that's probably sort of been flying under the radar for several decades. But again, best of luck. We'd love to have you on again.
Thanks so much, Warner. I appreciate it.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.